And just as we start, I would like to pay my respects to the people of the Wurrung and the Boomerang language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges the ancestors and elders past and present, and particularly acknowledges those who are with us today. RMIT acknowledges traditional custodians and their ancestors of all the lands and waters across Australia and in all communities across the world where we work and play. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for this really important panel session. We've got some of my favourite writers and researchers in the one room, which makes me incredibly happy. We have Megan Williams from Croakey Health, Misha Ketchell from The Conversation, Melissa Sweet from Croakey, Damian Thompson from The Conversation, and we're talking about non-profit journalism in Australia, a growing movement. So we are going to start with you first, Megan, if that's all right. Shall I hand the floor to you?
That's great. Thank you, Alex. Yiradu Marung. G'day, everyone. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal, one of 29 clan groups of the Eora Nation in Warung, now known as Sydney. And as Wiradjuri, I'd like to pay my respects to the ancestors and spirits of this land and the leaders in this community today. And we dedicate our time and our work to the young generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We've got a black and deadly future ahead if we let that unfold. And I'm a Croakey Health Media contributor and board member, and I'm here at the National Centre for Cultural Competence and mainly work on the justice health workforce, and find that media is a real determinant of the way the prison workforce thinks about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, hence connecting with Croakey Health Media and being
Oh, Megan, I'm really sorry. I've just accidentally muted you and I can't unmute you. I'm so sorry. I was trying to mute everyone else because there were some scratchy noises in the background and I did you.
No.
I'm so sorry.
Great. No, that's fine. Well, I'd like to welcome panel members. Would you each say where you're calling from and perhaps one reason you're on the panel today? And that's absolutely an Aboriginal cultural protocol to really locate ourselves, keeping in mind we don't have very much time either. So, Melissa, can I ask you to start?
Thanks very much, Meg, and thank you for the acknowledgement and introductions. I'd like to begin with acknowledging the Malakadi people. I'm speaking to you from Rutarita, southern Tasmania, and very much pay my respect to local people, to elders past, present, and emerging, as Meg says, deadly futures. And also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today, and at a recent Zoom workshop with Professor Bronwyn Fredericks from Queensland Uni, she reminded us that when we connect via Zoom, we're actually connecting across multiple nations right across the country. So paying respect to that as well. And, I really like to acknowledge Meg for her contribution to Croakey, incredibly generous in sharing knowledge and expertise that I know your plate is already extremely full. So one thing I'd like to get out of today, I think it's just really encapsulated by the title. I would just really love to see non-profit journalism fly in Australia develop. I think it's got huge potential to address a lot of the problems we have, whether it's in health or journalism. And so, it's an important conversation to be having.
It is. Great. Let's make it fly, as you say. Yeah, welcome, Damian. Thanks for joining us. Will you share where you're coming from?
Hi, everyone. Yes, Damian Thompson from, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Actually, very close to Burrung Ma and the Yarra River. And the reason I'm Director of Foundations and Fundraising for the Conversation, I spent 4 years in the US, where I worked very closely with our team there and with foundations to really fund and launch and build scale of the Conversation US. I've also been working closely with foundations in their support for other members of our international network, so Africa and Indonesia particularly. So looking forward to being part of today's discussion. I think philanthropy has an enormous amount to contribute to journalism, not just internationally, particularly in Australia as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you, and welcome, Misha. And we just can't hear you at the moment.
Can you hear me now?
Great, there
yes,
we are.
Excellent. Yes, I'm Misha Ketchell. I'm the editor of The Conversation. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri here in and really I'm part of this session because I'm very interested.
Oh, Misha. There is no conversation from Misha.
No, I'm sure he's saying some really interesting things, but we might have to, in the interest of time, keep moving along. Misha, we didn't catch some of the last things you said, but we know where you are and how to track you down and find out more, but we'll just keep the ball rolling time-wise. So audience, I want you to keep note of things you're learning today, things you don't agree with, and ask you, what can you do in the future of non-profit journalism in Australia? Make a note of those things. And any students here, big respect to you because you are the leaders of the future, and we really charge you with carrying this mantle today. We've got some actually really clear ideas about how to make progress and encourage each and every one of you to carry that forward. So I'd like to just start by getting more of a sense of what non-profit journalism is, because I know there's all these other terms. I'm not a journalist, I'm a health researcher, but I use journalism and the media as a research translation tool. I've heard all these things called public interest journalism, citizen journalism, cooperative journalism. Melissa, could you help start this off by explaining what is non-profit journalism, maybe who's doing it and how in Australia at the moment?
Thanks, Meg. And can I just challenge you on that when you say you're not a journalist? Because, you know, at Croakey we practice social journalism, which is really about a collective team, a multidisciplinary team. So you're very
there
much
we go. Okay.
Team. So I'd just like to make that point. So in terms of, you know, what non-profit journalism is, I think to speak very personally about my experience before talking more widely. So as someone who's worked in both mainstream corporate media and more recently in non-for-profit organisation, the things I like, you know, as a journalist about working in the non-profit sector are, I think it's much easier to really be values-driven in the non-profit sector. I mean, that's why you're there for a start. So it's about shared values for the team and for the community that you're working with and for. So I don't think, you know, this doesn't mean that you don't have sceptical thinking. It doesn't mean that you don't debate evidence. It doesn't mean that you don't provide a platform for diverse voices and viewpoints. You know, so it's still doing all those traditional roles of journalism, but I think for me what the difference is you know, having a clear set of values that drives your work. The other thing I really love about it is the money that you raise is invested into public interest journalism. You know, it's about journalism and providing a service to communities through journalism. It's not about profits for shareholders. So that's one of the, you know, outstanding obvious differences. I know it's obvious, but I think it's worth saying. And then the third thing I really love about working in non-profit journalism is it's really about innovation. You know, I think a lot of people might think the non-profit sector is about, oh, we'll just apply for a grant or have a philanthropist support us. But actually, I think it's a sector that really drives innovation because you can do things differently, makes you try new ways of doing journalism, and that's both at the practice level and the organisational level. And as I just mentioned, you know, I think it really facilitates that team approach to journalism. You know, we used to work in newsrooms where it was a very individualistic sort of model, you know, everyone competing to have their story in the paper or on page 1 or page 3 or whatever. So, you know, I really love the team collective approach. So at a personal level, I just find it a much more satisfying and rewarding way to work. So I guess that's just, you know, from an individual perspective. But looking more broadly, you know, as I said, I think we've got a lot of scope to develop the sector in Australia. Everyone looks to the States to see what they've done, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Damian. So, I think potential for it to be developed in innovation in association with communities, and particularly those communities that are not well served by media models at present.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And Misha, do these things resonate with you, and just delving more into how non-profit journalism differs from for-profit journalism and what you see from the conversation point of view, you know, around shared values, like what are those values, and the use of evidence and innovation as well.
Okay, well, hopefully you can hear me now. Is this working?
Yeah, that's working.
Excellent, great. Well, from my point of view, the thing that distinguishes non-profit journalism is that it doesn't have, I think, as listed on that same relationship to its audience that a commercial publisher has, because of the competing goals and priorities that you will have in a commercial environment. And you know, the key thing that I'd like to say is that I think for a healthy media ecosystem, we need all types of journalism. We do need commercial journalism. I think it's important and valuable. We certainly need public broadcasters. They play a very big and significant role. But a not-profit sector that is capable of being values-driven and capable of serving its audience in a way that is really about providing quality information, to me, is vital, particularly given the way that people are consuming so much information online. And what that's meant is that the monopoly of media ownership that used to dominate the way we got information is perhaps in some ways less dominant than it was, but there's more misinformation out there and more vested interests. And not-for-profit journalism has a really important role in that system.
That's excellent, and lots of things we'll return to. Yeah. And Damian, can we get a sense from you about the sort of international scope of non-profit journalism?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Look, I think I can talk from my experience, which, as I mentioned, I've spent 4 years in the US working with The Conversation, and really saw, you know, I guess over the last 10 years, non-profit journalism in the US has really grown and grown. And yes, it's about you know, serving readers, being, you know, focused on serving readers, being focused on values, but it's also an important, I guess, model or mechanism through which to fund journalism for particular communities and communities of interest. And I think that in that way, the growth of non-profit journalism and the role of philanthropy and other, that's philanthropy in terms of, you know, structured philanthropy, foundations, high net worths, and readers, has been really important in the evolution of non-profit journalism around the world. I think that's particularly so in the US. They're sort of ahead of the game in many ways, but it's also happening in Australia. Just in terms of my experience with The Conversation, growing really a model which brings together universities and their important role in our work, and bringing that research and that expertise together with readers. I've had the pleasure of, I guess, you know, helping to start up The Conversation several times over now, launching in the US, working with one of the Conversation's founders, Andrew Jaspin, on finding, you know, the 6 foundations that we had to launch The Conversation US, but also having experience working, getting The Conversation Africa started with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation involved, and The Conversation in Indonesia as well. So it's really interesting to see the growth of that model, how it can be adapted and applied in different contexts and different countries with different funders. But really, when it comes down to it, it's a really important and valuable model to be able to drive mission-driven journalism.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic to hear and to have your expertise today. There's so much to touch on. and understand the use of data, foundations to launch, pricked my ears. But I find that it's hard to talk in this space without acknowledging that we've been, you know, through a pandemic. And I know from the Croakey point of view that it's had both a really profound negative and a positive influence on Croakey's business. And there's as many difficulties as there have been opportunities. So I wanted to ask you, Melissa, if we could just sort of reflect on what we've been through before we move on to dreaming up this in Australia more positively. Yeah.
Thanks, Megan. I think, you know, that's a really good moment to reflect on how lucky we've been relatively in Australia. You know, you look around the world and you see the news of the pandemic and it's just absolutely, you know, horrifying. So, you know, just take a moment to acknowledge that. So for Croakey, as you say, the pandemic has been many things. And one thing I think is it's really, you know, and this has been my hobby horse for decades, it's really highlighted the importance of health journalism and not a narrowly focused approach to health journalism, you know, as it's often done as, you know, the medical round where it's all about healthcare or new research and interventions, but one that really interrogates the health impacts of all policies and wider decisions. So I think, you know, hopefully that's one thing, you know, we can learn in journalism, that we really need to change how we do health journalism. And, you know, in the same way that the pandemic's highlighted wider health inequalities and structural inequalities, you know, that we can reflect upon what that means for how we do our work as journalism. So, you know, it's an opportunity in that sense. But as you say, our revenue was hit really hard at the same time as our workload just doubled, really, and readership and engagement increased. So it's been a very tough year. You know, I don't know if you can see the bags, but thinking of the work of the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma, thinking of the recent research by Julie Cassetti and co, you know, it's also at a personal level been a really tough year for many members of our team. I'm sure, you know, all organisations are grappling with that as well. But then I just have the picture of, you know, the green shoots that come after fires, the new growth. And, you know, I know so many sectors, not just journalism, are thinking that, you know, the hashtag for the recent College for Emergency Medicine conference, one of them was hashtag no going back. So, you know, this is a moment to reflect on how we can do journalism differently going forward, you know, different models, different ways of doing it. And, you know, in health, I think the whole health sector has learned a lot from the Aboriginal community controlled health sector, you know, in terms of how well Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health services and communities have done in reducing risk from the pandemic. You know, previous experience would have suggested there would have been an increased risk, but in fact it's been reduced proportionately. So I think there's a lot all sectors can learn from that, which includes the importance of self-determination and community leadership. And so, you know, you reflect on what that might mean for journalism. What is self-determination for communities when it comes to journalism? It's nothing like the media landscape we've got now. I mean, I say that with all respect to the community broadcasting sector and, you know, acknowledging platforms like Indigenous X. Of course, there are examples of community-driven media, but by and large, our media landscape is not community-driven. So that, I guess that's one of my reflections.
Yeah, thanks. And Misha, you talk about media landscape and an ecosystem, and I wondered about, for the conversation, impacts in the pandemic, and maybe also about misinformation and disinformation as well, and has the conversation had a role there?
Well, I think, you know, we probably experienced something similar to what Melissa was talking about, in that there has been a huge demand for quality information. When the pandemic hit our audience, I think in the month of March we had some 14 or 15 million reads to our content in that month. So the demand for the content has been really strong. We had epidemiologists writing articles that were read more than 1 million times. And that was just Australian audience, you know, to those articles. People really want quality information that they can rely upon. But at the same time, you know, for any organisation which is not for profit, you know, it then does put pressure on you in other ways in terms of funding, fundraising capacity, Our futures obviously are very much tied to the university sector, and the university sector has gone through a very difficult time with really to be honest, a lack of support from federal government policy in terms of helping the university sector through this. So that's really been a very serious impact. I think the other point I want to pick up on that Melissa made, which is really important, is the one about journalism being driven by a community. It's very interesting because our model is working with experts to inject expertise and evidence into a different model. In that sense, is much more sort of a top-down and expertise driven model. But it's absolutely vital that we have journalism that is driven by the communities that are consuming that journalism and reflecting their needs. And there's a Senate inquiry currently into media diversity, and one of the issues is, does the media represent the diverse communities within Australia?
Yeah, excellent points to hear. And, someone in the tertiary setting, absolutely devastating, but yeah, vital that we have that connection to the conversation. I do see myself as part of that community. So there's the diversity in communities is really important as well. Yeah. So I wanted to ask Damian about, I suppose, your reflections on philanthropy at this time and support for non-profit journalism.
Yeah, well, I guess the pandemic has certainly been a big challenge for journalism. That's for-profit journalism as well as non-profit journalism, and philanthropy's played a crucial role. I mean, I think in terms of COVID-19, there's been lots of opportunities for kind of some relief funding for journalism. I think The Conversation was lucky to get some support from the Judith Neilson Institute and others for sort of COVID relief funding, but that's really not sufficient when you're looking in the longer term to the kind of crisis of revenue for journalism. But thinking about not-for-profit journalism, I think foundations often, I think, are involved in sort of are catalysts, and they're conveners, and they help drive innovation in terms of their capacity to support a journalism organisation in the long term. That's not always the case, and so there was a good story that I heard when I first arrived in the US, which was first I heard it from an old hand at fundraising for journalism, who said, "Well, Damian, you have to think about the lazy Susan. You find your first foundation and you launch something, and then you keep them on for as long as you can, and they'll hop off, and another one will hop on, and then the merry-go, the lazy Susan goes round, and it's a hop on, hop off sort of exercise." And then I think the next conversation I had was with a foundation, an old hand at a foundation, who said, some of these old fundraisers like to talk about the lazy Susan, and I'm going to tell you that's not true. We're not in the game of funding you in perpetuity. You're going to have to think about being innovative. You're going to have a plan for sustainability, and that's not always easy for non-profit journalism. But I think where foundations can really help, it's in capacity building, thinking about different business models and different funding options, sometimes leveraging and matching donations, or leveraging other philanthropy, or matching the donations of readers, and encouraging and nudging readers to make donations, and movement building as well. I think thinking about PIGI here in Australia, thinking about groups such as the Institute for Non-Profit News, which is kind of a representative body of non-profit journalism in the US, the role that philanthropy has in kind of creating visibility for non-profit journalism is really important. But I acknowledge that when it comes down to it, what organisations are looking for is funding to do journalism and to produce content for their readers.
Yeah, that's right. There's often an agenda there, isn't there, that the philanthropy has to pursue, and activities are tied to that. Yeah. Well, now that we have that out of the way, and it's such a short period of time we've got to talk, but I want to now move to expose what Aboriginal people know to do, and that's dream up the best practice for the future, and think big, but then break it down into roles and responsibilities, the relationships that are required. Things you've said about capacity building, real blackfellow way of thinking, always thinking about how to develop those skills and sustainability in the future. We do a lot of apprenticing as well, so that the next generation do come along on that journey and learn the ropes. So let's turn our minds now to thinking about how to grow a non-profit journalism movement in Australia, drawing together a lot of what you've said. And so maybe starting with you, Melissa, about communities, the community members, even though we've talked about us as in the tertiary sector being community members, but let's think about just, the mob on the ground and involving them. I know I've done Croakey Go activities, for example, that are draw together real diverse people from communities and walk together to talk together. But yeah, Melissa, can you give us some concrete examples, I suppose, of what you would dream up in non-profit journalism movement? We just can't hear Melissa at the moment, and a little bit of glitching too.
Sorry, rookie error. I think I just go back to the Archer model, about really thinking, look, we need to map where we're at, the communities that aren't being served at all, whether it's geographic or topic based or cultural backgrounds, whatever. And really, how do we meet those needs? And, some of that is place-based, some of that is, more like the conversation or Croakey around particular topics or communities of interest. And really have community involved in these conversations, because, we spend a lot of time at Croakey trying to engage wider civil society in these issues. Journalists talking about journalism is never going to achieve anything. I mean, you can see where it's got us so far with media policy reform in Australia, which is just, I think it's a desert landscape if you're considering the public interest, really. Even with the mandatory code that's now being developed, public interest, communities' interests are not being centred in that. If you look at the federal government's responses to the pandemic through the public interest news gathering program, that was not centering the public interest. We applied for those grants. We got a very small one. The grants are allocated on the basis of regional publishers, revenue and number of employees. Well, how does that do anything to solve the problems of communities that haven't got a local newspaper? So that there's just an endless long list of how public interest and communities' needs are not part of the conversations. And we're seeing that now with the development of the code. It's been a very small, closed process, and those wider civil society engagement hasn't happened. So I guess in engaging communities, we need to think about it both, from on the ground, doing those grassroots activities and connecting, all the way through, bringing different sectors into the process. And really, media reform is not media business, it's community business. So how do we make it community business? How do we make sure that, submissions to the Senate inquiry aren't dominated by the usual suspects? How do we make sure that the stakeholders consulted in the development of the code aren't just media companies? So I think there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done. And I really take Damian's point about, we need some structural reform, like a voice for the sector, to the non-profit journalism sector, because I think actually that is a lever. The non-profit journalism sector is a lever for bringing communities in much more. I think it's much more appealing for communities to engage with non-profit if non-profit is actually about helping solve communities' issues rather than generating money for, Mr. Murdoch or whoever. So, I think non-profit is a really great in to developing new community engagement participation at all levels.
Yeah, there's something trustworthy in that if a community media organisation is reflecting the values of that community and as well as the needs and interests of that community and plans. So you're talking about that mapping as well as structure to go with that growth in the future that we're dreaming up. And Damian, I wondered what what things would you carry forward in the way that you've engaged and developed the conversation, with all the supports, respectfully, that you've had to do that, but what strategies would you carry forward?
Well, look, for the conversation, you know, I think at the moment we're focused on building long-term relationships with funders, and that's something that I think is really important for all non-profit organisations to really manage partnerships over time, not just and to understand where foundations are coming from and what they're trying to do. I think in a broader level, though, in building on what the discussion so far, you know, creating the visibility of the non-profit journalism sector is really important, and showing the value of what non-profit organisation or not-profit news organisations have to offer. One really important conversation there, I think, is with Australian philanthropy, to show them that, you know, they can make an enormous contribution, and at the same time as, you know, foundations have agendas and they have purposes, helping philanthropists understand that sometimes cultivating the conditions for the changes that they'd like to see, with the ideas and the informed public that they need to make change, can be there's a really great opportunity for partnership there, I think, with non-profit journalism. And when it comes down to it, that is really just about doing good journalism that serves audiences' needs. I think that's really important. So the other thing there, I think, in terms of visibility, and if there was, you know, the ability to be able to kind of mobilise more support from philanthropy, philanthropy could also help, I think, you know, do things like the Institute of Nonprofit Newsers in the US with the Miami Foundation around something called Newsmatch, which is on now, I think, in the US, and that's where there's a pool of philanthropic funds to match the contributions of readers as they donate to non-profit journalism. And I think that's a practical thing that that the sector could work with philanthropy on.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Yeah. And Misha, as an executive in this field, what particular levers do you see are needed to pull in growth? And anything else you wanted to add into this?
Well, I guess the first thing I would want to say is just to sound a little bit of an alarm in terms of the relationships that journalism does have with its funders, because it is not a relationship that is unproblematic, in the same way that in commercial media outlets, people complain about proprietors and influence. If you have too strong a nexus with any individual funders, that can be an issue. So one strategy is having a diversity of funders. Another strategy is having some policies around independence. But one of the great difficulties with philanthropic funding for journalism is that philanthropists are very often, most foundations are driven by particular missions and a certain type of advocacy. They want to achieve certain outcomes. Generally, they're really good outcomes. They're to serve the public good, and they're outcomes that sort of sit well with a journalistic mindset and journalistic mission. Journalism at its most pure and at its best really is about serving its readers above and beyond anything else. And that service, in my view, is about arming your readers with information in a context where you've got the humility to let your readers then go and act on that information or not as they see fit. You're not trying to, put out propaganda or change people's minds about particular things. You really are providing an information service to your audiences. That's certainly how I see it. And I think that sometimes if there's too much philanthropic funding, foundation funding, you can lose sight of your readers at the centre of it, because the reality is that your contact with your readers is, you'll get feedback on Twitter and Facebook, and you get some emails, you get some communication from your readers. If you're in a role like mine, you spend a lot of time in rooms with your foundations and funders, with the powerful people who are providing the money. And so going again back to what Melissa was talking about, which was journalism that's embedded in communities and comes out of communities, you actually have got to be mindful of going back and listening to your communities, your community of readers, and trying to put them at the centre, not the people who are giving you the funding. So there's a tension there, I think, that we need to be aware of. I think your question was about the key thing that we have to do now, and I think the most important thing, there's currently a Senate inquiry into media diversity. We're preparing a submission for that inquiry, and we'll be talking about the importance of not-for-profit journalism in a healthy media ecosystem in that. I know that Melissa did one for the ACCC for the previous inquiries. I think it's at the moment it's at the level of advocacy, just talking about the role of not-for-profit journalism, its importance in the media ecosystem and why we need it, because we're still in the very early stage in Australia. Damian's experience is incredibly valuable. He's seen a massive amount of what's happening in the US. We've got very, very little here at the moment, so it's very early days.
Yeah, it is, and it's not sort of such a bad thing from an Aboriginal perspective, I suppose. And I think, yeah,
Lost Misha.
lost Misha a little bit. Yeah, that's right. Well, I was going to go back to the point Misha was saying about reflecting, like serving the reader and providing that information for the reader. And I know that you've been working at the conversation to increase your, is it readership or reach and participation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the conversation. And I wondered, you know, dreaming up the future and our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander populations increasing, what things can we do now to carry that forward as well? I wondered, reflecting on your experience in the last few months particularly. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is it working again? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so for the conversation, we have a really strong view that any national conversation in Australia about public policy has to have Indigenous voices absolutely at its centre. And because we work only with academics, that means finding and prioritising the voices of Indigenous academics. That sort of is really central to what we do. Recently, we launched a policy that was around encouraging more Indigenous academic conversation, and really it was about went out and found the voices of Indigenous academics. So we set up some rules around if a piece was written on a topic that really related specifically or predominantly peoples, we would try to seek Indigenous authors or co-authors. We've got some criticism of that policy for being somewhat essential or sort of prioritising people's, you know, racial background or indigeneity over and above their academic expertise and their particular knowledge. And we've sort of been back to editorial board and we've refined it a bit now. So it's a little bit more about just making sure that editors place at the centre of their work the idea of prioritising Indigenous voices and making sure that we get to those Indigenous academics. But that's a piece of work that really is absolutely fundamental, because if the conversation is going to play a leadership role in public policy debate, we think that it's important that the Indigenous voices be at the centre of that debate.
Yes, we won't get any disagreement from me about that at all. And it is about the tertiary system too, trying to meet its staff targets. So this is that ecosystem, isn't it? You can't do what you need to do unless we in the tertiary sector do what we've promised to do in policies and with national guidelines about how to do that. Yeah, so it's very much one of the challenges we face is increasing our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander staff numbers, and we find that when we I know I'm just extremely overloaded, and the pressure's really great on us. We're very visible in the university as well as in the community, with the community responsibilities that we've got as well, and wearing multiple hats and serving multiple interests, as well as trying to actually pursue our own interests and skill sets. You know, I'm really a researcher about the health of prisoners. I'm not just an Aboriginal researcher who can comment and work on Aboriginal everything. But yeah, so we I guess are just so worn thin by those competing demands. But it's reciprocal, because the more we can be published, say, in the conversation, the more we encourage other Aboriginal people to consider academic careers, and we break down the narrative about what research is and where research results go. So we equally really rely on the conversation and also Croakey to be able to find and use our voice in ways that the community can understand, not only the peer-reviewed academic articles that the community is completely locked out of. Yeah, so very challenging for us, but really important to have your support, definitely. So it's been great to see that dedicated piece of work and consideration that you've taken despite the criticisms and challenges. And it's blackfella way, it's probably every human's way too, in trying to grow something, to think ahead about what the challenges are and reflect now on what the challenges are. And so regulation's one that comes to my mind, and I wondered if we could talk a bit about that. We've got about 15 minutes left to go. Definitely wanted to talk about the sort of policy landscape and challenges, and whether there are any real practical things that we can do to create change that's going to support non-profit journalism. And then anything we can think about from the international context as well. And then also, I suppose, for me to step back a little and have any more free thoughts from all of you as well. So yeah, so firstly, shall we have a bit of a yarn about challenges? Yeah, Melissa, I know we've talked about that US House of Representatives inquiry and the market power of Apple and Google, and the need for systemic reform about regulation. And I think that crosses a bit into that concern about the authoritarian actions and contraction of local community publications, attacks on press freedom. So what does all of that mean for non-profit journalism? And what have we got to improve for the future?
Thanks, Megan. Just coincidentally, this morning the Australia Institute had a webinar with Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate economist, and Anya Schuffen from Columbia University, which was all about regulation of digital platforms and sustaining public interest journalism. So it was a really good precursor to this conversation. And if anyone's interested, Murray McInerney and I from Croakey both live tweeted it. So between us, we covered quite a lot of it. And, you know, they were making the point just how powerful the digital giants are, and that the world is watching what's happening in Australia with the regulation, and, you know, how important it is, not just for us, but globally. And Joseph Stiglitz made the point, actually they both did very powerfully, that there is no good business model for public interest journalism at present. It's a public good. We shouldn't expect there to be a business model. We should just pay for it from the public purse in the same way that we do fund research, for example. So, you know, it's a very strong argument that we just need to, you know, we need to regulate the digital platforms, but really the mandatory code and things like that, they're just a small piece of the puzzle. And Richard Dennis made the point, we need to use our imaginations, you know, really think big and look above as well. You know, we have to find ways to sustain the valuable roles of public interest journalism. We've seen that. Look in the States with the terrible outcomes from the pandemic, you know, which can be traced to multiple things, but part of that is people not having good quality information, you know, not having trust in evidence, etc. You know, it actually kills people. That's where we're at. So, you know, we are in a moment where we should really be thinking big picture and looking for solutions to sustain. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, little non-profits like Croakey, we're just little tiny, you know, if we're in the ocean and News Limited is a shark and the digital platforms are a great big whale, you know, we're not even as big as a plankton. It's very hard, you know, to do what we need to do when the power imbalance is so great. So how can we change that as a society? I think. Anyway, it was a good conversation, and I encourage people to check it out. It will be online.
Yes, thank you for doing that. Amazing too, to live tweet something like that and make that information available. So, Misha, do you have any?
Just that I think, Anya Schifrin and Joseph Stiglitz are terrific, and I think they're absolutely right on this issue, which is we need to understand that there is a public benefit, and the business models to support this public benefit are very problematic, and for a whole bunch of things where there is no sort of necessarily effective private market solution, there's government policy that you support this for the public good in the same way that you have a public health system, and if you think about it, for democracy to survive, you need clean information in the same way that you need clean water for health. It's absolutely clear that we don't have clean information currently, and our democracy is suffering because of the infection of disinformation. And it's absolutely clear that any responsible sort of government policy setting would make sure that we have that clean information as a foundation for our democratic political system. So, there are opportunities to legislate. There are some things we've seen with the ACCC, with the Digital Platforms Inquiry. There have been little pieces, but there's something sort of bigger that needs to be done in terms of government understanding and supporting a healthy information ecosystem in Australia. And that's a piece of work that's yet to be done, really.
Yeah, so some nods from you, Damian. Yeah, what are you thinking?
I absolutely agree with the previous speakers and Misha and Melissa. And I think I'm also thinking about not just the creation of content, but the distribution of content. And I think that's sometimes thinking outside the square about the role of philanthropy, for example, it can help you think about, okay, well, how do we, create good information? How do we create clean information? But how do we also support the ecosystems and the distribution of that clean information and get that to the people who need it or who need to see it in the places that they look for information. And I think that's kind of the challenge that we're looking for government to help regulate, create the right regulations, but also for philanthropy and the contribution of everyday news consumers to fund.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I wanted to ask Melissa something kind of specific in policy about the deductible gift recipient, and we at Croakey had applied for that but not been successful. So some comments on that, and of course, Misha and Damian, any insights you've got into that too.
Thanks, Megan. I think it goes to the wider point that there is no sort of easy, straightforward pathway to set up this non-profit journalism in Australia. I mean, how we got set up as a non-profit is, fortunately, one of our contributors knew a corporate lawyer who gave us pro bono services over a year, and their advice was to set up as a health charity because they thought we would have more luck that way. So, as you know, we had to contort ourselves into describing ourselves as a health charity, which, by the way, is a terribly outdated definition of what a health charity should be, but that's another story. And when we applied for DGR, we didn't get it. So it's very difficult to get DGR. The way that I understand others have done it is through, knowing someone in the Treasurer's office or having someone do some lobbying for them in Canberra, etc. So, the Walkley Foundation and others have taken that path, and I don't know the backstory of the conversation, but there should be a straightforward process so that if communities want to work with journalists to set up their own non-profit organisation, it's not difficult to do. It's straightforward. I mean, it should be pretty straightforward to satisfy criteria that you're doing public interest journalism. I can't imagine it's going to be a huge drain on the public purse. I know the Public Interest Journalism Initiative and Judith Nelson Institute no doubt, looked at that side of things. I don't think there's any economic argument against it when you consider, as we've been talking about, the enormous public costs that we're now wearing because of the failure to have a well-informed public and policy process. And, you know, we've talked a lot about the pandemic, but we haven't touched on the other glaring global health crisis, which is the climate crisis, which really, it's all of us should be working on in some ways when you think what an existential threat it is to us. And it's so easy to go off and get distracted by other things day in, day out. But really, when you talk about a vision for the future, how do we picture the world's going to be in 10 or 20 years with the climate crisis? And how are communities going to be solving their needs for good information? How are policymakers going to be solving their needs for good information? So, sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a rant from DGR status, but that's where the DGR status question leads you. Oh, I can't hear you. Here.
Meg, your microphone.
And okay, and here's Misha as well. I'm sure the things Melissa was saying were not the reason that you hung up on us, Misha. As outrageous as they are, so some people think. But yeah, do you have anything you want to add in there about DGR status and the practicalities of setting up as a nonprofit, but also just more generally as well?
Well, really just that what Melissa says is right. The process is entirely political. It's about who you know. You have to know somebody. And there are many worthy organisations that receive DGR status, and it's terrific to see. But when those that miss out for opaque reasons, I think it's
that Teams is muting the expletives that he might be using.
He's giving us all the secrets behind the scenes.
That's right.
I think he needs to do something about his internet.
We thoroughly concur, though, and you know, it is extremely challenging. And Damian, what about you? And then thinking internationally again, you know, about structures that are used over there. You're over there, whatever that is. Sorry.
Yep. Well, I mean, firstly, I agree with Melissa that, you know, a clear pathway, one that's, you know, more democratic and inclusive and transparent for DGR is important. Internationally, I mean, we've got 8 editions of the conversation around the world. They are all not-for-profit companies in their own ways, and we've got several, in fact, who are struggling or working on trying to get charitable status to allow deductible donations, gifts right now. So, you know, for example, the Conversation Canada has been working on that process for a while. I guess the question, in the US, we've got a 501c3, and you know, and the UK, we've got an education trust, and they're both building up their, I guess their donor bases and starting to really bring some funding from donors. The other thing to say, I guess, is that you do see media organisations who are able to make donations without tax deductibility. And in fact, I heard a conversation recently with some people from the Stanford Philanthropy Centre talking about the fact that people more and more are giving to their local communities without needing to think about deductible gift recipient status. And I think DGR perhaps is a very obviously a very helpful pathway and very good for thinking about, you know, high net worths, major gifts, even mid-sized gifts. But where you've got a strong brand and a strong connection to a community, you know, DGR is not going to be the be-all and end-all of what you can do from raising funds from your readers and from the communities around you. And so I think, you know, there is lots of work to be done, and there's lots of things that you can do outside of DGR, but agree that it should be more than
Yeah. And is there anything else that you'd like to add, just from, I suppose, any issue that you're grappling with at the moment or would like us to think about in going forward? Yeah, Melissa.
Well, can we ask Alex a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
What could the role of JIRA be in helping to grow a non-profit sector?
To grow the non-profit. I do think that the journalism students that we do, you know, a lot of the journalism students do work for non-profits. You know, we create news and you know, for communities that don't otherwise have them. I know UTS has been sending journalists to newsrooms. We can provide, you know, students for interns, so we can sort of, you know, just through power provide that. And we'd much prefer to provide interns to, you know, organisations that needed them and would care for them than maybe some big outlets that really don't want to support them. But also more broadly, I mean, that's just the student perspective, but the journalism within universities is a growing thing. I mean, there's not just the conversations. We've got the RMIT ABC fact check unit within, you know, with us, and I think that there is going to be even greater kind of collaborations in that publishing space occurring between academics on particular areas. I think it's, yeah, as long as the universities survive. Of course, we're all in a very difficult situation, as we all know.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm very conscious that we have 2 minutes before the next session.
Yeah.
Even though I would really love to continue talking.
Yeah.
There's so many wonderful issues here. So
yeah.
From my perspective, thank you very much for joining us at the JIRA Conference 2020. And I'm sorry that we haven't been able to see you and welcome you in person, because we would love to, one day we would love to have you on our campus at RMIT. And there's so much that you all give, and we would love, you know, if you're ever in town, please give us a call. We would love to have you here.
Great. Well, thanks for having us, Alex, and the time to explore and share these really important issues going forward. Awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Mandanguru. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Goodbye.